Greetings, conservatives. This is your humble host, John Moraga, and we are back with more ConservaCast. We look forward to keeping you informed with the latest and most relevant commentary of conservative issues. So without further ado, here are a few topics I'd like to discuss. The first topic I'd like to address is the controversial bill out of California, AB 2943, which essentially outlaws the commerce of conversion therapy. And although it specifically addresses mental health providers and financial transactions for these types of services, it actually goes a little bit more beyond that. And the letter of the law may not ban Bibles or prohibit religious free speech outright, but the spirit of the law really does. Christian apologist, Dr. Michael Brown, has addressed this for some time. It's part of what he does in his ministry, among many other things. But he has addressed something that the gay activist community has itself said has been part of their goal. And it is a two-pronged approach to changing societal perceptions of the community. The first prong was to change the psychology world view on homosexuality. That being that they have been successful actually in removing it as a diagnosis in the DSM. The DSM is essentially the main text to which the psychology world diagnoses certain types of disorders or psychological conditions. And so prior to them being successful at this, it was actually diagnosed as a mental condition. That is, homosexuality was actually recognized in the psychology world as a disorder. Once they were able to get that removed and have it more normalized, the next prong to their approach was to address the religious community, in that they wanted to remove it as a taboo, as a sin. And so that's what we've kind of been seeing over the past few decades, is they've been successful at one prong of their approach, and now they're really going after the second prong. And thankfully, they haven't been as successful within at least the dialogue amongst real believers and genuine believers. But they have chipped away at some of the more legal things that can be done within the religious community. And that's kind of what we're seeing with this bill now. Now, just to back up a little bit, they have successfully passed a bill in, I believe, 2011 that already addressed this for minors. It's now illegal to have any type of counseling given to anybody who is under 18. Now this bill broadens that to a person of any age. And so the controversy here is that the free speech of ability and the attempts of those who may make a professional living off of this will now be restricted in how they're able to approach these types of issues. Where it gets even more convoluted is at what point does it cross over to the nonprofit world or religious clergy who may be trying to address these issues within their own congregations. That is yet to be seen until it's actually challenged in courts. And it's similar to the case of the baker who was forced to make cakes for gay weddings. Thankfully, the Supreme Court recently has struck that down and found that he was not obligated to do so. But this is a similar case to where until we actually see a court decision, we won't know the extent of how far this could go. Who will be the thought police as to what is considered conversion therapy in a commercial context? It's unfortunate that we have to wait until this bill is challenged through courts, but at this point right now, it seems like it's already going through. It got approval in the California Assembly and then moved on to the California Senate. And what happened in the California Senate for approval was that they did need to make a few amendments to specifically lay out that there were still some provisions that would allow the religious community to still engage in some type of nonprofit conversion therapy services, and that it wouldn't specifically ban the sale of Bibles. The spirit of the law is a real attack on religious freedom and freedom of speech. And the old saying, as California goes, so goes the rest of the country. Now, that's not always the case, but it is more often than not the situation where California leads the way for a lot of these social engineering ideas and activism. And so this is where it becomes important for the entire country, not just in California. If this is successful and it's resistant to any type of appeal, then there are some things that the rest of the country and other states may be having to consider with this issue. The next topic I'd like to address is Justice Kavanaugh, the most recent appointment that President Trump has recommended to be appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, he apparently came from a list of justices from the Federalist Society, which is revered and acknowledged as a pretty conservative organization. However, he was appointed by George W. Bush during his term in office to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. The point I want to address is that he's recently had some conversations that could be taken with a grain of salt or could be taken more seriously, especially with Susan Collins of Maine, where he's expressed the idea that Roe v. Wade is, quote, settled law, end quote. Now, that might be very heated language if it's not understood within legal context. He could technically have said that to appease her and calm her concerns about being controversial on that issue, but he could also have stated that as just an objective statement to which he could or may not be a deciding factor in the future of that stated law or settled law. The reason being that if there is a unique case that may come up or if there's some type of decision that needs to be made, there's no telling necessarily that he would uphold the existing types of application to the law, or if he would side with a majority who would perhaps take a different approach that would restrict, if not outright abolish, the decisions made in Roe v. Wade. But that's also why it becomes a big concern to conservatives. The idea that he's not as firm on his opinion on this issue is caused a lot of conservatives to scratch their heads and be a little bit more reserved about why they may have voted for President Trump when they did. One of the arguments that was made to support and ultimately vote for President Trump in 2016 was that he would appoint conservative justices to federal courts, especially the Supreme Court. So it would be quite disappointing, to say the least, if his most recent recommendation to the Supreme Court, Justice Kavanaugh, wound up not being as conservative as we would like, especially on this issue of Roe v. Wade. The last topic I'd like to discuss today is some news from Israel. They're apparently relaxing their firearm laws to allow for more civilians to carry firearms or at least be eligible to receive firearm licenses. According to the Jerusalem Post, dated August 21st, 2018, an article published reads, quote, Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan announced new criteria Monday, making hundreds of thousands of IDF infantry unit veterans eligible to receive firearm licenses. In addition, Erdan decided officers and commanders will not be required to return their arms and weapons license after they are released from reserve duty. Many civilians saved lives during terror attacks, and in an era of lone terrorism, the more skilled civilians carrying weapons, the greater the chance of thwarting attacks without casualties and reducing the number of casualties, he said. Until now, among other criteria, Israelis could get a gun only if they have what was considered by the Public Security Ministry to be a good reason, such as if they work in a security or law enforcement, or if they live or work in a settlement in which the state has an interest in arming some residents. In addition, former officers in the IDF and other security branches above a certain rank could get a license. End quote. So essentially what they're doing is allowing those who have at least served in the military, once they get out, to retain their legal licenses to carry arms, or at least reapply if they have already been out for some time, and make it easier for them to do so. Now, just speaking from my own personal experience, I've addressed on ConservaCast before. I was a security forces member in the United States Air Force, which essentially was mainly tasked with anti-terrorism and law enforcement tactics. So this speaks directly to my own personal experience in that I don't necessarily need to have an armory in my home, but the idea that people such as myself or others who have an honorable discharge and have had professional training in this, there would be an overwhelming added security to our own country if we were able to continue to carry the weapons that we were assigned out of the military. Now, that would be unheard of these days, but it's definitely something that I can relate to and understand why they would want to do that in their own country, especially considering that they are the targets from almost every border that they have. So this is a definite move towards allowing them to have a little bit more of a defense within their borders, even if they're not protected by the active military or even the reserve military. And visiting Israel myself, it's a different experience when you're there and you see on the streets, it's almost like martial law, but it's not as much an active martial law. The difference being that you don't have tanks and jeeps rolling around, and you don't have people set up to actively engage. But you do see people in uniform in the regular shops, the restaurants, and they have their M16 rifles with them. They're armed, and it's almost just everyday life. So understanding that whether or not somebody's in uniform or whether they're not actually makes it tougher for terrorists to carry out their attacks because they don't know who may be armed. Whereas they could identify somebody with a uniform on and see, okay, well, they've got that target there that they might want to avoid, and so they'll go somewhere else. With this new law, or with these relaxed applications of this law, it allows there to be that added ambiguity as to who may be able to thwart these terrorist attacks, which actually is something that might want to be considered here in our own country, not necessarily this exact move, but allow the rest of the civilian world in America to understand and appreciate the need for these types of security measures. Here, there's a lot of liberals and left-wing activists who are trying to restrict our gun control, or who are trying to restrict our access to guns and have more gun control. Whereas Israel here is understanding that some of their criteria may need to be relaxed for the sake of their own defense. If you haven't already, please check us out at GoFundMe.com/Conservatives Corner. GoFundMe.com/Conservatives Corner. Once again, that's GoFundMe.com/Conservatives Corner. Thanks for joining us once again, and we hope you will invite your friends and family to join us in our efforts to champion conservatism for generations to come.
But it wouldn't be nothing. Not a woman or a girl.